You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon, and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Now presenting Spanish Flu Part 3. Section 1 Effects World War I. Scholar Andrew Price Smith has proposed that the influenza virus may have influenced the power dynamics in favor of the Allies during the latter part of World War I. He points out that the Central Powers, such as Germany and Austria, were affected earlier by the disease and suffered greater rates of illness and death compared to the Allies, specifically Britain and France. This is supported by a study published in The Lancet in 2006, which shows that Germany and Austria had significantly higher death rates due to the virus than Britain and France. Furthermore, Kenneth Kahn from Oxford University Computing Services acknowledges that numerous experts believe that wartime conditions facilitated the spread of the flu. Some also believe that the outcome of the war and the terms of the peace treaty were influenced by the epidemic. Kahn has created a computer model that allows individuals to evaluate these hypotheses on their own computers. Section 2 Effects Economic. Numerous companies in sectors like entertainment and services experienced a downturn in their income, while those in the healthcare sector saw an increase in profits. According to historian Nancy Bristow, the increase in the number of women pursuing higher education during the pandemic played a role in the advancement of women in the nursing profession. This was partially due to the inability of predominantly male medical doctors to control the spread of the disease. In contrast, the predominantly female nursing workforce took pride in their effective patient care and did not view the proliferation of the disease as a consequence of their practices. Research from 2020 indicates that American cities which adopted non-pharmaceutical interventions such as quarantines early on did not face extra economic hardships because of these actions. However, the accuracy of this research has come under scrutiny due to its overlap with World War I and concerns about the reliability of the data. Section 3 Long-Term Effects. Research published in the Journal of Political Economy in 2006 uncovered that individuals who were still in the womb during the flu pandemic had less education, more physical disabilities, lesser earnings, and a generally lower social and economic position than those born at other times. They were also more likely to receive government assistance. Another study in 2018 confirmed that the spread of the flu negatively impacted the education levels of affected communities. Additionally, there's an association between the flu pandemic and a subsequent surge in cases of encephalitis lethargica during the 1920s. Those who survived the flu often experienced an increased risk of dying earlier than expected. Moreover, some of the survivors continued to suffer from health issues caused by the infection. Section 4 Legacy. Although the Spanish flu caused widespread illness and death, its memory gradually faded over time and was largely overshadowed by other historical events until the late 20th century, when renewed interest emerged due to contemporary outbreaks of diseases like bird flu. Some historians consider the Spanish flu to be a forgotten pandemic, but this notion has been debated. Guy Boehner, for instance, has explored how the pandemic's memory was eclipsed by World War I memorials and often excluded from general historical narratives, but nonetheless preserved within private and localized memories worldwide. A few reasons are given for why the Spanish flu didn't stay prominent in the public's consciousness. The swift and devastating impact of the flu, particularly in the United States where it caused most deaths in a short span, didn't lead to extensive media attention. Additionally, at that time, society was no stranger to widespread diseases such as typhoid and cholera, which may have made the flu seem like just another one of many outbreaks. Furthermore, in certain regions, there was little to no reporting on the influenza, with occasional mentions only in adverts for so-called cures. World War I's significant death toll and media coverage also contributed to the diminished attention the flu received. Many victims of both the war and the pandemic were young adults, so the high number of wartime casualties may have overshadowed those caused by the flu. Obituaries of the period would present deaths from both causes side by side, and in Europe, where the war had a particularly devastating effect, the flu might not have seemed as psychologically impactful, perhaps perceived merely as a continuation of wartime suffering. Additionally, both the duration of the war, which unexpectedly stretched over 4 years, and the pandemic significantly influenced how they were perceived and remembered. Section 5. Legacy in literature and other media. Even though the pandemic had significant effects, it didn't become a prevalent subject in the realm of American literature. Historian Alfred Crosby has suggested that this might be because the pandemic was overshadowed by World War I, which deeply marked that era's population. One of the more notable works that delves into this period is the 1939 piece Pale Horse, Pale Rider by Catherine Ann Porter. Additionally, the 2006 book The Last Town on Earth explores a community's efforts to curb the flu's spread by isolating themselves. More recently, The Pull of the Stars, authored by Emma Donoghue and set in Dublin amidst the Spanish flu, was completed in March 2020. Given the contemporary relevance amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the novel was rushed to publication. Section 6. Comparison with other pandemics. Compared to the Black Death, which claimed a significantly higher proportion of the global population and persisted over a longer period, the Spanish flu resulted in fewer fatalities on a percentage basis. As for the COVID-19 pandemic, it is believed to have caused between 17.5 and 31.4 million deaths. Section 7. Research. The exact beginnings of the Spanish flu pandemic and how it simultaneously emerged in pigs and humans has sparked much debate. One theory is that it all started at Fort Riley, Kansas, where viruses from poultry and pigs used for food at the fort could have transferred to soldiers who then spread the infection worldwide. The genetic makeup of the virus shows a resemblance to bird flu viruses, and because the pandemic in humans occurred before swine flu cases were documented, experts theorize that the virus initially passed from birds to humans, and then from humans to pigs. However, this notion is contested, and further studies suggest that the virus might actually have come from another mammal. Estimates place the origination of this virus in mammals between 1882 and 1913, and it's believed to have split into human and pig versions between 1913 and 1915, with the last shared ancestor of human flu strains dating from early 1917 to mid-1918. Pigs are known to catch bird flu more easily than humans, hence the suggestion that they could have been the intermediary, catching the virus and then passing it on to humans during this period. Efforts to rebuild the Spanish flu virus, an H1N1 subtype, involved contributions from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, the USDA ARS Southeast Poultry Research Laboratory, and the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. This partnership led to a breakthrough on October 5, 2005, where they announced they had deciphered the virus's genetic structure, drawing from tissue samples of an Inuit woman's remains from Alaskan permafrost and preserved samples from American soldiers. By January 2007, researchers reported that monkeys infected with this recreated virus displayed symptoms like those seen in the 1918 pandemic and suffered fatal immune system overreactions, which could explain why healthier, younger individuals were hit so hard by the Spanish flu. In September 2008, an attempt was made to extract RNA samples from Sir Mark Sykes, a politician who passed away in 1919, to understand the relation to modern bird flu, but the body was too decomposed for this to be successful. However, research continued, and in December 2008, Yoshihiro Kawaoka from the University of Wisconsin associated the virulence of the Spanish flu with 3 specific genes and a nucleoprotein, which in animals replicated the disease's lung-invading, pneumonia-causing capabilities. Fast forward to June 2010, a study indicated that the vaccine for the 2009 flu pandemic could offer some protection against the Spanish flu strain. Until the experiments in labs, the 1918 flu was seen as strictly a human disease. A 2013 model by Air Worldwide assumed that if a similar pandemic happened today, it would result in massive insurance losses and a significant number of fatalities in the United States. Then, in 2018, Michael Worobey found historical pathology slides offering potential new insights into the 1918 pandemic's origin. These slides were from an outbreak of respiratory illness in Etaples, France, reported on by William Rolland in 1917. Lastly, a 2021 study analyzed the immune response of the 1918 flu survivors by using the virus sequence to generate the hemagglutinin, HA, antigen. They discovered that all 32 survivors they tested still showed an immune response, and several had memory B cells capable of producing matching antibodies years later, highlighting the long-lasting capability of immunological memory. Section 8. Sex differences in mortality. The exceptionally high death toll is one key characteristic that distinguishes the influenza pandemic from other outbreaks. A noteworthy observation is that men succumb to the disease at higher rates than women, and this discrepancy was especially pronounced in men with pre-existing health issues. Tuberculosis, a major killer in the early 20th century, predominantly affected men over women. However, as the influenza pandemic escalated, the number of tuberculosis fatalities in men began to drop. It has been suggested by various researchers that tuberculosis contributed to the elevated death toll from influenza in men, leading to a reduction in their average lifespan. While tuberculosis was initially more prevalent among men, during the influenza outbreak, female mortality due to tuberculosis started to rise, continuing to fall only after the pandemic had subsided. The age group most severely hit by the pandemic was 20 to 35 years old, which is somewhat akin to the demographic impact of the Black Death in the 14th century. The interplay between tuberculosis and influenza was documented, with each disease exacerbating the severity of the other, particularly in men who were more commonly affected by tuberculosis. Men experienced a dip in life expectancy during the pandemic, but it rebounded within 2 years after it ended. In terms of Newfoundland and its experience with the influenza pandemic, social behaviors played a significant role in the spread of the virus. Men, often more socially active and on the move due to work, experienced a greater mortality rate from the disease. Nonetheless, the impact of the pandemic varied by region, with factors like nutrition also influencing outcomes. Before the pandemic, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in Newfoundland, and those with this condition were hit harder by the flu. The fishing industry, critical to Newfoundland's economy, required significant mobility from men, increasing their exposure and potential for spreading the virus. The pandemic reached Newfoundland later, coinciding with the summer months when the demand for fishing-related work was at its peak, leading to substantial movement of men along the coast and their families to the region. Though men initially had higher mortality rates, women's mortality surpassed men's during the later waves of the pandemic, notably affecting areas with larger female populations. Concerning Canadian soldiers during the pandemic, the loss of life was most pronounced in young men in their 20s, a group that also represented the typical age for military enlistment. These young men's movements, particularly in 1918, were linked to the widespread transmission of the pandemic. The assembly and subsequent dispersal of sick soldiers at Halifax in 1917 and 1918, who remained instead of traveling to Europe, increased influenza cases among males. Military researchers, employing data from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which accounted for the deaths of nearly 2 million persons during the World Wars, noted the death toll from the pandemic years of 1917 and 1918. The transfer of soldiers and the travel between Canada and the United States during this time seemed to have substantially advanced the spread of the pandemic. Section 9. Etymologies. Throughout history, pandemics have been given various names that reflected the time, geography, and cultural understanding of disease. In the past, before the discovery of viruses, the cause of influenza was a mystery, leading some, like the Sierra Leone Weekly News in July 1918, to describe the confusion with a biblical reference from Exodus 16. Man who, meaning what is it? The 1916-17 flu outbreaks in British military hospitals in Etaples, France, and Aldershot, England, shared symptoms with what would be known as the 1918 flu pandemic, such as swift symptom progression and a distinctive bluish-purple discoloration of the face upon death, dubbed the Purple Death. Despite recognizing similar disease manifestations, medical professionals did not yet understand that a particular AH1N1 virus was responsible. The 1918 flu arrived in Kansas, USA, during the late spring and was initially termed epidemic influenza, or the grip. Around the same time, it was being reported as three-day fever in both Spain and the United States. Historically, diseases often received names that implied foreign origins, such as the Russian flu of 1889 to 1890, which carried various national labels. Similar naming practices resurfaced in 1918, falsely branding the flu as Spanish influenza due to Spain's uncensored press coverage of the illness during World War I. This misnaming occurred despite the fact that Spain, neutral during the conflict, had no need to suppress information to maintain the facade of military readiness. The disease was dubbed the Spanish Lady when it hit Moscow, further perpetuating the incorrect Spanish association. Despite protests from a Spanish official in the Journal of the American Medical Association, who claimed that Spain was unfairly blamed and that other countries were similarly affected, the moniker persisted. At one point, the consensus shifted to pin the origin of the flu on kind and neutral Spain, highlighting a pattern of shifting blame rather than finding scientific evidence for the disease's origin. Section 10. Other exonyms. Initially, the French media referred to the outbreak as the American flu, but later shifted to Spanish flu to avoid offending their allies. British troops in the spring of 1918 named it the Flanders flu, and German troops called it Flandern fever, both references to a notable Belgian battlefield where the illness affected many. In Senegal, the illness was dubbed the Brazilian flu, while Brazilians referred to it as the German flu. The Spaniards labeled it the French flu, or Naples soldier, the latter inspired by a song from a theatrical production. Today, Spanish flu is widely used in Spain, although it remains a point of contention. The naming of the flu often mirrored political and racial tensions of the time. Poles called it the Bolshevik disease, and the Bolsheviks referred to it as the Kyrgyz disease. Some African communities saw it as a disease brought by Europeans, whereas whites in South Africa derogatively named it Kafersikte. In Japan, a narrative blamed sumo wrestlers returning from Taiwan, terming it the sumo flu, even as several top wrestlers succumbed to the virus there. To avoid perpetuating stigma, the World Health Organization advises against geographically or culturally biased disease names. It discourages terms like Spanish flu and encourages more neutral terms such as 1918-1920 flu pandemic. Various indigenous languages across the world referred to the flu without implicating specific nations or people, often describing the symptoms or societal impact. For instance, Northern Ndebele mentioned Malibuzwe, meaning investigation into the disease, while Swahili described the symptoms head-on. In Yao, it was termed Chipindupindu, referencing wartime profiteering associated with the disease, and in Ochiherero, it was likened to a bullet passing through. This pandemic also had other names that reflected its scale or were influenced by other events. It was known as the Great Influenza Epidemic, connecting it to the Great War. French military doctors initially labeled it Disease 11, and German doctors tried to minimize its seriousness by calling it pseudo-influenza. African doctors, on the other hand, used influenza vera to emphasize its legitimacy. A child's song from an earlier flu pandemic in 1889-1890 became popular again in 1918, used as a jumping rope rhyme, highlighting how quickly influenza, abbreviated as ENZA, could spread.